At 14:23 on the afternoon of December 16, 1944, Corporal Franz Huber pressed his back against the frozen trunk of a shattered pine tree. As the grinding roar of American tank engines echoed through the Hürtgen forest, less than 400 meters down the ravine below him. If you're fascinated by the forgotten soldiers who changed the course of battles through sheer courage and improvisation, hit that like button and subscribe for more untold stories from World War II's most brutal campaigns. Franz Huber was 24 years old that winter, but his eyes carried the weariness of someone twice his age. He had been a baker's apprentice in Salzburg before the war, a young man who enjoyed hiking in the Alps and playing accordion at village festivals. The Wehrmacht had conscripted him in early 1940, trained him as a pioneer, a combat engineer specializing in demolitions, mine-laying, and fortification, and sent him through campaigns that turned the Austrian mountains of his youth into distant, dreamlike memories. He had fought in France, watched Paris fall, then spent 2 years on the Eastern Front, where winter meant something entirely different than the crisp, clean cold of his homeland. Russia had taught him that cold could kill as efficiently as bullets, and that a soldier's greatest enemy was often not the man across no man's land, but exhaustion, disease, and the slow erosion of hope. By December 1944, Huber found himself assigned to a Kampfgruppe of the 89th Infantry Division, holding a desperate defensive line in the Hürtgen forest against the American advance toward the Roer River dams. The forest was a nightmare realm of splintered trees, frozen mud, and constant artillery fire that turned ancient pines into deadly shrapnel. The Americans called it the Death Factory. The Germans had no special name for it. It was simply another place where young men died for meters of frozen ground that meant nothing to anyone except the generals studying maps in warm headquarters dozens of kilometers away. Huber's specialty had kept him alive when so many others had fallen. While riflemen charged and died, he worked behind the lines, laying mines, rigging booby traps, preparing demolition charges on bridges and crossroads. It was technical work that required patience, precision, and a steady hand, qualities that had saved his life more times than he could count. He had learned to read terrain the way a sailor reads the sea, understanding how a simple fold in the ground could channel an enemy advance, how a fallen tree could become an obstacle that forced tanks into a killing zone, how a bridge could be wired so perfectly that it would collapse the moment the first enemy vehicle reached its center span. On the morning of December 16th, his company commander, Hauptmann Werner Dietrich, had received orders to fall back to secondary positions 3 kilometers east. American forces were pushing hard through the forest, supported by armor, and the thinly stretched German line could not hold. The withdrawal was to begin at 15:00 hours, with all personnel moving in staged retreat, while rear guards covered the movement. It was a standard tactical withdrawal, the kind that had become routine on the Western Front as German forces gave ground slowly, day by day, trading space for time. But at 13:47, Huber had climbed a shattered observation post, little more than a partially collapsed bunker on a ridge, and spotted something through his binoculars that made his stomach tighten. 3 American Sherman tanks were advancing along a narrow forest road in the ravine below, infantry moving cautiously behind them. The road was little more than a logging trail, barely wide enough for the tanks to pass single file, hemmed in by steep slopes on both sides. More critically, Huber realized with cold certainty, that road led directly to Forsthaus Schönberg, a forester's lodge that the regiment had converted into a casualty collection point. More than 200 wounded men lay there, too badly injured to move quickly, waiting for trucks that would never arrive in time if those tanks kept advancing. Huber had scrambled down from the observation post and found Hauptmann Dietrich at the company command post, a dugout reinforced with logs and packed earth. The captain was a veteran of North Africa, a professional soldier whose face carried the deep lines of someone who had made too many impossible decisions. Huber explained what he had seen: the tanks, the road, the timeline. If those Shermans broke through, they would reach Forsthaus Schönberg within 40 minutes. The wounded would be overrun or captured. The evacuation trucks needed at least 90 minutes to arrive and load the casualties. Huber proposed staying behind, alone. He would take his demolition kit, the company's remaining teller mines, and use the terrain to stop the tanks long enough for the wounded to be evacuated. The captain had stared at him for a long moment, then shook his head. That's idiotic, Huber. You'll be killed. 3 tanks, infantry support. You're one man with a satchel of explosives and a rifle. You'll die for nothing. But Huber had persisted. He explained the terrain, the narrow road, the steep slopes, the frozen stream that ran parallel to the trail. He could create choke points, force the tanks to stop, maybe even destroy 1 or 2. He knew demolitions better than anyone in the company. He had trained for this. The captain had listened, jaw tight, then finally said, "You have 90 minutes. If you're not at the rally point by then, we assume you're dead and we move without you." Now, at 14:03, Huber crouched alone on the forested slope, watching the lead Sherman grind its way up the narrow trail. The sound was immense, the roar of the 500-horsepower engine, the metallic clank and squeal of tracks on frozen ground, the crack of branches breaking under 30 tons of armored steel. American infantry moved in loose formation behind the tanks, rifles ready, DEs scanning the tree line. They were cautious, professional, well-trained. They expected resistance. Huber's heart hammered against his ribs. His hands, even inside thick gloves, felt numb from cold and adrenaline. He carried a canvas satchel containing 4 kilograms of TNT blocks, detonators, wire, and fuses. Strapped to his back were 2 Teller anti-tank mines, each containing 5.5 kilograms of high explosive, enough to blow the tracks off a Sherman, if placed correctly. His Carabiner 98K rifle was slung across his chest, 5 rounds in the internal magazine, a dozen more in pouches on his belt. He had a single stick grenade, a bayonet, and a half-empty canteen of water that had frozen into slush. He had perhaps 400 meters of trail to work with, the stretch between his current position and the point where the road opened into a clearing that would give the tanks room to maneuver. 400 meters to stop 3 Shermans and buy 90 minutes. The mathematics seemed impossible, but Huber had learned in Russia that impossible was just another word for difficult. The first choke point was 200 meters ahead, where the trail narrowed even further, as it passed between a massive boulder on the left and a steep drop-off on the right. The lead Sherman would have to slow down there, perhaps even stop to navigate the tight space. Huber moved through the forest parallel to the trail, staying low, using the terrain and the noise of the tanks to mask his movement. His breath came in quick clouds of vapor. Every sound seemed amplified, the crunch of frozen leaves under his boots, the rustle of his equipment, the pounding of blood in his ears. He reached the boulder and quickly assessed the position. The rock was 3 meters high, mossy and ancient, immovable. The Sherman would have to pass within half a meter of it to clear the trail. Huber unslung one of the Teller mines and examined the ground. The earth was frozen solid. He couldn't bury the mine properly. Instead, he placed it against the base of the boulder, camouflaged it with broken branches and snow, and rigged a simple pressure trigger using wire stretched across the trail at track height. When the Sherman's left track hit the wire, it would detonate the mine against the boulder, channeling the blast into the tank's vulnerable side armor. It was crude, improvised, and might not work at all, but it was better than nothing. Huber scrambled up the slope and took position 30 meters away, behind a fallen log, his rifle ready. The lead Sherman appeared around the bend at 14:38, moving slowly, cautiously. The tank commander was unbuttoned, his head and shoulders visible in the turret hatch, scanning the forest with binoculars. Huber could see the man's face, young, maybe 22, clean-shaven, intent. An American kid from somewhere Huber would never see, doing his job, trying to stay alive. The Sherman's engine roared as it approached the narrow gap. The driver was good. He eased the 30-ton machine through the space with careful precision, tracks churning frozen earth. The left track was 3 centimeters from Huber's wire when the tank commander suddenly raised his fist, the signal to halt. The Sherman stopped. The commander was looking at something on the ground, leaning forward, squinting. Huber's chest tightened. Had he seen the wire? The mine. For 15 seconds, that felt like 15 minutes. Nothing happened. The Sherman's engine idled, a deep, rumbling growl. American infantry had stopped 20 meters behind the tank, taking cover behind trees, watching. The tank commander said something into his intercom, then reached for the radio handset mounted inside the turret. Then the Sherman lurched forward just half a meter, and the left track caught the wire. The explosion was enormous, a flash of yellow-orange flame, a concussive blast that Huber felt in his chest even from 30 meters away, a spray of rock fragments and metal shrapnel that tore through the air like horizontal rain. The mine's 5.5 kilograms of explosive, channeled by the boulder, punched through the Sherman's left side armor and detonated inside the crew compartment. The tank shuddered, thick black smoke pouring from the driver's hatch and turret. Flames licked up from the engine deck. The tank commander collapsed backward, disappearing into the turret. Secondary ammunition began cooking off, small pops and cracks that became a sustained roar as 75mm shells detonated inside the burning hull. Huber didn't wait to see more. He was already moving, scrambling up the slope, forcing his legs to pump despite exhaustion and fear. Behind him, American voices shouted commands. Rifles cracked, bullets zipping through branches above his head. He threw himself behind a thick pine trunk as a burst of automatic fire, probably a Thompson submachine gun, chewed bark from the tree beside him. The first Sherman was dead, blocking the narrow trail. But the other two would find a way around, or the infantry would push forward on foot. Huber had bought maybe 15 minutes. He needed to buy 75 more. He moved through the forest in a wide arc, staying off the trail, heading for the second choke point, a place where the trail crossed a frozen stream via a small wooden bridge. The bridge was old, constructed from rough-cut logs, barely strong enough to support a tank's weight. Huber had scouted it days ago and noted its potential. Now he prayed he still had time to exploit it. He reached the bridge at 14:52, breathing hard, legs burning with fatigue. He could hear the Americans behind him, not close but moving, coordinating, pushing forward. They would be more cautious now, knowing at least one German was still active in the area. That caution would slow them, but not stop them. Huber pulled the TNT blocks from his satchel and crawled under the bridge. The stream below was frozen, a winding ribbon of ice between snow-covered banks. The bridge's support beams were thick logs, notched and fitted together with iron spikes. He had 4 kilograms of TNT, enough to drop the bridge if placed correctly. He jammed the blocks against the central support beam, pressed detonators into the soft explosive, and ran wire back along the stream bank to a firing position 15 meters away, where a fallen tree provided cover. He was halfway through wiring the detonator when he heard the grinding roar of tank engines again, closer now. No time. He twisted the wires together with shaking fingers, connected them to the detonator's contact points, and pressed himself flat behind the log. The second Sherman appeared through the trees at 15:03, moving more slowly than the first, its commander fully buttoned up now, only periscopes visible. The tank paused 50 meters from the bridge. Huber could imagine the crew's conversation, checking the structure, debating whether it would hold, looking for signs of demolition or ambush. American infantry had spread out in a loose perimeter, rifles ready, eyes scanning the forest. After 2 minutes, that felt like hours, the Sherman began moving again, approaching the bridge cautiously. The tank's weight made the wooden structure groan and creak. Huber waited, his thumb on the detonator plunger, watching the Sherman roll onto the bridge. He wanted the tank centered, maximum weight on the structure, before he blew it. The Sherman's front track plates reached the bridge's midpoint. Huber pressed the plunger. The explosion lifted the center of the bridge upward in a spray of shattered wood and iron fragments, before collapsing it entirely. The Sherman's front end plunged down into the frozen stream, its nose driving into ice and mud, rear end tilting up at a 45-degree angle. The tank couldn't move forward or back. It was stuck, hung up on the broken bridge supports, tracks spinning uselessly. The crew would be shaken, disoriented, but probably not seriously injured. The Sherman was disabled but not destroyed. Good enough, one destroyed, one disabled, one left. But now, Huber faced a problem. He had used both teller mines and all his TNT. All he had left was his rifle, one grenade and whatever improvisation he could manage. And the third Sherman, warned by the fate of its companions, would be extremely cautious. The American infantry would push forward aggressively, knowing a lone German was harassing them. Huber pulled back from the stream, moving uphill, trying to put distance between himself and the Americans. He could hear them clearly now, shouting orders, coordinating movements, pushing forward in tactical bounds. They were well-trained, disciplined, professional, and they were angry. One of their tanks was burning, another was stuck. They wanted whoever was responsible. At 15:18, Huber reached a small clearing on a ridgeline where several large pines had been shattered by artillery fire weeks earlier, their trunks broken and leaning at crazy angles. He could see the trail below. The third Sherman was advancing carefully, infantry spread out ahead of it, checking every shadow, every potential ambush point. The tank was moving slowly, methodically, learning from what had happened to the others. Huber had no more demolitions, but he had a rifle and 5 rounds, and he had an idea born of desperation and the kind of tactical thinking that comes from watching too many men die for stupid reasons. He positioned himself behind one of the leaning pine trunks, 30 meters above the trail, and waited. When the Sherman came into view, he didn't aim at the tank. He knew his rifle rounds would bounce harmlessly off armor. Instead, he aimed at the American infantry officer coordinating the advance, a lieutenant holding a map case and radio handset, standing beside the trail giving orders to his squad leaders. Huber's first shot took the lieutenant through the chest. The man dropped without a sound, map case falling from his hands. Instant chaos, infantry diving for cover, the Sherman's turret swinging toward the sound of the shot, its .50 caliber machine gun opening fire, tracers tearing through the canopy above Huber's position. He shifted position, moved 10 meters, fired again, this time at a sergeant who was trying to rally the squad. The sergeant went down, clutching his legs, screaming. Huber wasn't trying to kill everyone. He was trying to create confusion, fear, and delay. Every minute the Americans spent pinned down, treating casualties, trying to locate the sniper, was another minute the wounded at Forsthaus Schönberg had to evacuate. He fired his remaining 3 rounds at careful intervals, shifting position after each shot, not trying for kills, but for suppression, for psychological effect. The Americans returned fire with everything they had, rifles, machine guns, the Sherman's weapons, turning the forest into a storm of lead and shattered wood. But Huber kept moving, staying low, using terrain and the thick forest to mask his movements. At 15:34, his rifle was empty. He had no more ammunition. He was out of options except one. Keep moving, stay alive. Keep the Americans fixated on hunting him instead of advancing. He abandoned his rifle, keeping only his grenade and bayonet, and began moving through the forest in a wide circle, deliberately making noise, breaking branches, leaving tracks in the snow. He wanted them to follow. He wanted them to waste time chasing a ghost. The American infantry took the bait. He could hear them moving through the forest behind him, calling out positions, coordinating their sweep. The Sherman remained on the trail, unable to follow through the dense trees, its crew probably reporting the situation to higher command, requesting support, explaining the delays. Minutes passed, then more minutes. Huber kept moving, exhausted now, running on adrenaline and willpower. His legs like lead, lungs burning in the cold air. At 15:47, he heard a new sound from the east. Diesel engines, multiple vehicles, grinding through forest trails. The evacuation trucks. They had reached Forsthaus Schönberg. The wounded were being loaded. His 90 minutes were almost up. Huber allowed himself one moment of relief, then kept moving. He had to survive now. Had to make it back to German lines. Had to complete the mission by not becoming another casualty. He circled wide through the forest, avoiding the Americans, moving by compass bearing and instinct toward where he thought the company rally point should be. He reached friendly lines at 16:41, nearly 2 hours after he had stayed behind, exhausted and shaking with cold. Hauptmann Dietrich was there, supervising the company's withdrawal. When he saw Huber emerge from the tree line, the captain's expression shifted from surprise to something that might have been respect, though he said nothing about it. "The wounded made it out," Dietrich said simply. 214 men, get in the truck. Huber never learned the names of the Americans he had killed or wounded that afternoon. He never learned if the tank commander in the 1st Sherman had survived, though he suspected not. He never learned if the infantry lieutenant had died instantly or suffered. These were questions he would carry for the rest of his life. Questions without answers, debts without resolution. The Battle of Hürtgen Forest continued for another 2 months. The Americans eventually pushed through, taking the forest at terrible cost. 33,000 casualties. The Germans lost 28,000. Forsthaus Schönberg was overrun 3 days after Huber's stand, abandoned and empty, no longer militarily significant. The wounded he had helped evacuate were redistributed to hospitals further east, where many died anyway from infection, shock, or simply the accumulated trauma of too many wounds and not enough medicine. Franz Huber survived the war. He was captured by British forces in April 1945, spent 2 years in a POW camp in England, and returned to Austria in 1947 to find his family's bakery destroyed by bombing, and his father dead from a heart attack in 1943. He never spoke about the incident in the Hürtgen Forest. When his wife asked about the war years later, he would only say that he had done his job and survived, nothing more. He felt no pride in what he had done, only a deep and complicated sadness. Sadness for the Americans he had killed, for the wounded German soldiers whose suffering he had merely postponed, for the entire vast machinery of death and destruction that had consumed 6 years of his youth and millions of lives for reasons that seemed increasingly meaningless with every passing year. He opened a small bakery in Salzburg in 1951, married in 1953, raised 3 children, and lived quietly until his death in 1998 at the age of 78. His obituary in the local newspaper mentioned his wartime service in a single line, with no details. His children knew he had been a soldier, but knew nothing of what he had done. He kept no medals, no souvenirs, no photographs from those years. He wanted only to forget, though he never fully could. The incident was never officially recorded in German military documents. Chaos and disorganization in the final months of the war meant many small actions went undocumented. American records noted the loss of 1 Sherman to a mine and damage to a second on December 16, 1944, in the Hürtgen sector, with casualties from sniper fire, but attributed it to enemy resistance with no specific details. No one on either side thought it particularly remarkable. The war was full of such incidents, small, desperate struggles that meant everything to those involved and nothing to history. Franz Huber was not a hero in any conventional sense. He fought for a regime that committed unspeakable atrocities. Though he himself was not a Nazi, he was simply a young man conscripted into a war he hadn't chosen. His actions that December afternoon saved the lives of 200 wounded German soldiers, but cost the lives of several young Americans who also deserved to go home to their families. There is no moral arithmetic that can balance that equation, no framework that makes it clean or simple or satisfying. What his story illustrates is something more complicated and more human than heroism or villainy. It shows that even in the industrialized slaughter of modern warfare, individual courage, skill, and sacrifice still mattered. One man with knowledge, determination, and a willingness to risk everything could change outcomes, could buy time, could make a difference in ways that commanders moving pins on maps could never fully control or predict. It shows that soldiers on all sides were human beings, afraid, exhausted, trying to stay alive while doing what they believed was their duty, caught in forces far beyond their understanding or control. The war destroyed Franz Huber's innocence, but not his humanity. He killed men he bore no personal hatred toward, to protect men he would never see again, in a forest that held no strategic value, in a war that was already lost. And then he went home and made bread for 50 years, a quiet life earned through survival and worn like a penance for things he couldn't change and couldn't forget. History remembers the great battles and famous generals, the decisive campaigns and dramatic turning points. But the war was also made up of thousands of small, desperate actions like Huber's, Moments when individual human beings made choices under impossible circumstances, paid prices that couldn't be measured in medals or monuments, and carried the weight of those choices for the rest of their lives. These are the stories that matter most, because they remind us that behind every casualty statistic and every strategic map, there were real people, young, frightened, brave, flawed, human, trying to survive what they could not control and could never fully understand. If this story moved you, hit that like button and subscribe for more forgotten stories from World War II that reveal the human cost behind the history books. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and whether someone in your family served in any conflict. Their stories, like Franz Huber's, deserve to be remembered, not as propaganda or glory, but as truth. Because the real cost of war is counted not in territory gained or lost, but in all the lives that were irrevocably changed, in all the young men who came home carrying burdens they would never fully share, in all the quiet suffering that lasted decades beyond the final shot. That is the history that matters. That is what we must never forget.